Thanks for that, Dudu. You're absolutely correct. And that's part of what feeds into the nature of conversations that take place between the various political parties. Of course, by and large, you'll hear them talk about, we are not voting with this person based on ideology or any other reasons, really, that politicians will be able to find. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to resources, who has what share of the pie. And it's a crude way of putting it, Khaya Sithole, but these are the realities of what happens in government, even in local government.
Yeah, and I think obviously we can't shy away from the fact that in the horse trading that we're going to see over the next 14 days, the question of the allocation of portfolios is going to be a remarkably important one. And I think obviously the most recent example that we have is how the ANC and the Patriotic Alliance have dealt with that question, in that the late Mayor Jeff Makubo had then allocated one of the MMC positions to a PA leader, and that obviously meant that the Patriotic Alliance could at least be in charge, or at least control or influence rather some of the entities that fell under that particular portfolio. So of course it is the political principles, the mayor and the speaker, those are the primary positions, but I think also the allocation of executive portfolios within the structures are going to be equally important.
Political parties will always say that the control of these portfolios is primarily about improving service delivery. But part of the reality is that there is this relationship in our political culture that sees what happens in parties quite entrenched with what happens in the governance of institutions. There isn't that clear line, regardless of which party you're talking about.
I think it's a clear consequence of having the ANC being so dominant historically, and also the DA in Cape Town, in that obviously because there was that linearity between you being in charge of national government, where the policy is set, and then being in charge also at regional and local level, you could then say, well, since we're implementing uniform policies across the system, we can simply do as we please. So of course, if you had been coming through, for example, as an alternative party candidate or from another party, and then you say, wait, hold on, those policies dictate this, the governance system dictates this, then perhaps there would have been a greater clarity between what the roles and the responsibilities are. But those overlaps are indeed a consequence of having had one party for such a long time. And let's be honest, it was a party that was not immune to the ideas of interference and actually mixing up the governance system so that people wouldn't know where the boundaries are. And maybe under coalition structures, maybe that becomes a bit clear, because you literally have to tell everybody what the boundaries are, and when people overstep those boundaries, they're probably going to start calling each other out, rather than us having been the ones that say, wait, hold on, don't do it that way.
In your more rural municipalities, these allocations often are coming in the form of grants or any additional support that is coming out of National Treasury. So yes, there's some money that is available, but by and large marginal when you compare it to the budgets that the metropolitan municipalities are working with. What does that mean for the kind of contestation that we are going to see during this process of negotiation?
So I think with rural municipalities in particular, there's essentially a single source of funding, which is the national allocations. And I think that is essentially an allocation that's already spoken for. You literally get given an allocation and you have to sort of work on a shoestring budget. So the latitude or the capacity to then sort of do a lot more horse trading in relation to resources is severely limited then. In the metros, however, you actually have a blended model where there is some allocation from the national fiscus, but then there's also a lot of income generating activities. So if you look at the city of Johannesburg in particular, it has a lot of city controlled and city owned income generating entities. Now what that means is that obviously the resources are much wider, but also the question of who you can then sort of allocate a particular portfolio is a much more wider question than it is in rural municipalities, where there's essentially one rand to spread around. So what you're going to see here happening over the next 10 to 15 days is really a question of, well, if we give you this particular political power or access to political power, what is in it for us? And of course, every single coalition partner will want to say, well, actually, we want to be able to indicate to our voters that we're capable of running something. Now, clearly, it won't be the entire structure, but give us something that we can go back to our own voters and say, actually, when we form part of this coalition structure, we're able to exhibit exhibit our capacity to do things, so therefore that becomes a template, and that's what we saw with the Patriotic Alliance having been given the economic development portfolio under the leadership of Jeff Makubo. Of course, things turned sour, then they started suing each other, but that is essentially what we're about to witness in the horse trading that's going to happen for the big metros.
Much of what this moment presents is that some of the smaller parties often see it as an opportunity to throw their weight around and to start making demands and say, well, actually, you know, I want X, Y, and Z. And then the bigger parties turning around and saying, well, we're not desperate, we don't have to work with you, so we don't like your terms and conditions, there's the door.
Yeah.
The way in which the outcomes of these elections in some of these metros is set up does not create that much opportunity to show people the door.
Yeah, and I think since there's many more potential collaborators that any large party can get into bed with, you probably don't see the party like the EFF in particular in 2016 was ultimately the kingmaker, because they were literally the ones that dictated the fate of the city of Tshwane. They dictated the fate of the city in Johannesburg in particular. So they had been the ultimate kingmakers, and there wasn't anyone else with the type of clout that they enjoyed. I think that point has now been distributed more evenly, in that we still do not know whether it will be the Action SA or EFF that become the ultimate deal makers in the city of Tshwane and in the city of Johannesburg. So I think that diffusion of the voters across multiple parties actually means that there's going to be many more conversations, many more iterations of the conversations than what we saw in 5 years ago. And remember, 5 years ago, it all came down to a single request by the EFF to say, remove your president as the ANC and we're in bed with you. And the ANC didn't have an appetite for that because of the political fallout that would have happened internal within the ANC. And that's why we never had an EFF and ANC coalition 5 years ago. Had the ANC entertained the idea of removing Jacob Zuma because the EFF had demanded it, we may well be talking about a different outcome in relation to what we've seen in the past 5 years.
Khaya, the changing of these results again and how they're configured across the spectrum is not inconsequential. Whichever way we look at it, in some parts of this country, especially those 47 where there are hung councils, and others where parties that were less dominant have now become more dominant, people have lost jobs. Those are the realities that we're dealing with. There is going to be a fallout. Something like a place like eThekwini immediately comes to mind. We've seen how the nature of that contestation results in violence even pre-election. What do you anticipate to see where the fallout of this is concerned? Because much of it could well stream back into these political organizations and potentially deepen the fragmentation where it already exists.
It's quite unfortunate, and I think obviously one of the sad realities of what we know about South African politics is that people who are career politicians do not naturally migrate onto other career paths. So for them, if they've really defined their career on the basis of their participation in that political structure, and then suddenly there's less positions to allocate, and then you get sidelined, or at least you do not make that list, it becomes difficult for them to migrate onto alternative careers. So of course there's always the question of, well, can you then perhaps go back and work the political program so that you become first in line? Should there be a reshuffle of some sorts? That's how it ought to happen. But unfortunately, recent history of South Africa does indicate that there are usually a few guns involved and a few bullets involved when people particularly cannot decide who should get a particular position. What also makes it a bit difficult, particularly for the ANC, is that it tries to balance so many considerations. So we do know that one of their rules is that if we are in charge and you're trying to put together a mayoral committee, then there has to be the gender balance, which means that as somebody who may have been, way down on the list, then may get elevated on the basis of trying to get that balance right. And of course, if I was a person who worked to get my way to the front of that list, and then I get bypassed on the basis of somebody else being given that position, I've got a right to feel anxious. We saw that example with Sputla Ramokgopa, who then had to actually be removed from the city of Johannesburg. The ANC was lucky enough that they could find a position for him in the presidency to be the head of the infrastructure, but that's now going to be a much wider problem. There's going to be many more disaffected ANC leaders who say, I've worked for the party all my life, and in the very first instance that we've been dislodged from power, why am I the one that's being removed? It's definitely not going to be easy, and I feel bad for the acting Secretary General who's going to have to somehow make the call and say, you go in, and if that coalition works, you go in, and then you stay out, because it's 5 years in the wilderness.
The ripple effects of where we are and what this moment truly means are going to continue to be felt. And you know, the reality is that we just don't know. We just don't know what it is that political parties will be willing to put aside in the sake of establishing these governments, because ultimately it is the residents and the citizens of the country that are going to want accountability, that are going to want to see a tangible change in their life, at least at a local level, and the delivery of services. We'll continue